All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Aftershow for the Magnus Carlsen Invitational. Today we had the third round, second day action going on, and we had matches featuring MVL, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, against Ding Li Ren, and Jan Nepomniachtchi against Anish Giri. Tough matches. I mean, we will go through all of the day's games. I think today we'll try to have time to go through all of them. It was a day with more draws than some of the other days that we've seen. However, one of the matches went to Armageddon, which is always pretty exciting. Some people are not fans of Armageddon. I'm curious what the audience thinks here. I kind of like Armageddon because I think I like the idea that every game matters and that you can, you're forced to try to win, and I think it incentivizes players to try to win in the regular games to avoid the Armageddon, because of course the Armageddon is very cruel in some ways. And so far, MVL, while he's had two sort of tough losses, we'll go through the Armageddon game of today, where in the game against who was he playing? For some reason, I'm blanking, but Nepomniachtchi, right? He got the Armageddon and sort of fell for an opening trap with white. Today in the Armageddon game, he kind of falls for an opening trap with black, and we'll go through it. I don't know if it happened on purpose or not, but we will see. Is there something wrong with the sound here? I'm asking people. Just want to make sure. Okay, looks to me like it's okay. Someone in the chat was saying that it wasn't working in French, and so I was just making sure that my sound is on. Of course, I am probably not the tech master that everyone would like me to be, but I'm trying to learn. So here we go. So the MVL game, the MVL match ended in Armageddon, sort of in a cruel way. Poor MVL, who is, I'm a big fan of MVL. For some reason, in these Armageddon games, he's had two difficult ones where, of course, you're always trying to play really fast. But in both cases, one time with white, one time with black, he's had really bad losses. So, but this match was a pretty evenly matched games, and I guess MVL has been playing D4 in this tournament. So we're going to go through the first game first, where he starts with D4 with white. Normally, of course, he's more of an E4 player, and so this is he's played sort of a different repertoire in this tournament. People have speculated whether he'd rather keep his main openings and secrets for something like the candidates. But we had Alireza Firuja on the stream today, who of course is not in the candidates, but he was saying that he thinks players are basically playing what they have, because who knows when the end of the candidates is when the tournament is going to be resumed, and so it's kind of hard to know whether the right thing to do is to hide your stuff and try to save it, especially because rapid can be a slightly different strategy, of course, or whether you want to actually show your best stuff, because one, there's a lot of money on the line. Two, maybe these online tournaments are sort of the way of the future, and you want to be winning them. So, but he's been playing D4, and then he's been getting some Nimzos, and so Ding Li Ren plays a Nimzo Indian here. And he plays D5, which is one of the main moves. You can also castle or play castles, or C5 are all playable. D5 is a bit of a more forcing line. There's a lot of theory that starts with A3. Bishop takes here, and then there's been a lot of developments in this stuff recently, with like a plan with B6, Bishop A6, which became popular. So, and of course, there's also C takes D5, which is what he plays here. And now white played E takes D5. Queen takes D5 is another move that leads to kind of very different positions with knight F3. But we won't go through that. So he goes E takes D5, Bishop F4. Bishop G5 is much more common. Bishop F4 is playable too. We'll kind of go through some of the differences. There's less pressure on the D5 pawn with Bishop F4, but it's also a lot less theory. So castles, E3, C5. Someone says nice glasses. Thank you very much. These glasses will soon need to be replaced, because my 1-year-old daughter keeps tugging at them, so they're getting a little loose if I move my face. So C5, D takes C5, and so this became sort of the discussion of the day here, because they played it in two games. This happens again in the third game that they play. But the position here that they get, which is a very normal looking position after bishop e2, has been played by none other than Karpov against Kasparov in their world championship match I think it wasn't a world championship match. I thought it was Kasparov-Karpov in 1985, so I assumed it was a world championship match, and that's probably right. And so this position where black plays d4 happened in the match. And typically in these isolated queen pawn position, if you can achieve the d4 break, or d5 if you're white, this typically is considered to be sort of the equalizing move. And sometimes even a little bit better for black. In this particular case, it's kind of complicated because of course white has the possibility of pinning black with rook d1, but it looks like a safe position for black, safe enough anyway. So he goes rook d1. In the Kasparov-Karpov game, they actually played pawn takes d4, knight d4, queen d4, bishop g3, and bishop e6. And the game was a draw. I mean, it was an interesting game, but it doesn't seem to me like too much of an attempt for white to be better this line. I actually like what MVL did a little bit better. He played rook d1, queen b6. Normal, he wants to get out of the pin. Takes. Bishop, castles. Bishop d7. Bishop d7 was not the only move. There might have been other possibilities, but it looks fine. And now MVL plays queen d2, which more or less forces black to play bishop takes c3, because on bishop c5, which is the other move, then you have bishop e5, right? And so you're kind of putting pressure against these pieces. You can't play bishop c6 because of this. You don't want to ruin your pawn structure like that. And yeah, what else? There's rook d8, but that position, I looked at it a little bit. It gets pretty, it looks a little bit, this doesn't look fun. So maybe this still is playable to a computer, but to the human eye, this looks very, very difficult. But Dingley Ren's plan seemed to be to play bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, and this is a structure, the symmetrical like this that we saw in the Carlsen Caruana game that we looked at from yesterday. And so this is very fresh in our mind. It's a little bit different though, because this is a better version for black, because white doesn't have a bishop on this diagonal pressuring the b7 pawn. His bishop is already out, and so it's closer to being equal than in the other game. So the game goes on. There's certainly more that we could look at here, but we'll fast forward a little bit. It certainly seemed like white had the better chances in this draw, but it wasn't quite enough. So here they've transitioned to an opposite colored bishop endgame with double rooks, which are, if there's no rooks at all, so if you take all the rooks off, then they could probably just shake hands right away, because there's no, as long as the black king is able to come to stop the b pawn from queening, then a position without queens here, you put all your pawns on the white squares and just wait, and there's not going to be anything that white can do. But with rooks, you always have chances. So they play a little bit, but it was very good defense here from Dingley Ren. Bishop d3 was a move that Peter Zvidler pointed out was very good. And here it just becomes essentially equal. And so g5, strong move. Again, the more pawns come off, the more there's really nothing for white to play. And so here they eventually just agreed to a draw. So decent game for MVL, but he didn't come that close to winning. So not, so a reasonable start, but players still kind of studying each other, you could say, I guess. So in the second game, they go into the Slav. Dingley Ren does seem to know the Slav from the white side, especially very, very well. So this is all sort of a big theoretical line, and it seems like white had a preferable position here, and so I think he might have regretted playing e5 so fast here. So in this position, so bishop e2 here. What was I looking at here? I think here, I'm trying to remember. I'm sorry. I've done a lot of different things today, and so I'm losing my train of thought. I think here maybe he should have played actually e5 first, because when he castled e5, the problem is that the position that he gets here is a nice looking position, but I think it's not really easy to prevent the trade of all the major pieces on the C file, and so it's kind of close to a draw. Which, I think with the opening position that he got, he probably could have been happier than that. You wonder if he could have stopped maybe playing stop black from playing b5 by playing a4. I don't feel like this is the best version for black with a6. And MVL, by the way, is not necessarily a typical Slav player, right? His repertoire, we were saying, with white he's been playing d4, and with black he's been playing the Slav. Normally he's a Grunfeld player. It's interesting the switch from the Grunfeld, because he suffered a little bit in the candidates to Grunfeld, so it's possible that he just decided, you know what, like I don't feel like testing everyone's preparation to Grunfeld. And we'll see in today's match, Nepomniachtchi did play the Grunfeld against Anish Giri with black twice, and I think in both games he was suffering at some point anyway. I don't know if it was the opening that was the reason for the suffering, but he was definitely suffering. But okay, so let's go. I mean, what he did was all reasonable, but I feel like maybe the structure can be very good for white if you're able to prevent trades and just play for an attack on the king side. But the way they obtained it here, the rooks get doubled on the c file, and without rooks, then it's closer to a draw than to a win. And so MVL managed to hold this one quite comfortably here. Without queens, you have the bishop pair, but the d4 pawn is too weak. It actually got a little bit messy here, which probably sort of surprised everybody. And I do wonder. So he decided that the opposite colored endgame here was not that great, which certainly is possible, but it didn't look to me like this would be winning for black. But I guess he decided not to test this. I mean, the problem is that if in these opposite colored bishop endings, if you get two passed pawns, then of course two passed pawns become dangerous, sort of regardless of the pawn count. So it's not so much about being down a pawn, but about whether getting the two passed pawns. But I have a feeling that he's not going to be able to get a good version of it. Like if we put the bishop on this diagonal, for example, I don't know how black. I guess they'll try to bring the king to d6 and play e5. I could see that maybe it's a little bit. It feels a little bit dangerous to do in a game. So he played bishop d3. Of course, MVL gets out of the pin, and they get this position. And objectively, I guess it should be a draw. And in fact, now it looks like maybe white eventually tried to win. So it sort of went back and forth. Black was a little better. Now maybe white is a little better because they have a chance to get the outside passer. But ultimately, I think neither side missed anything that was winning. It was just well played enough to hold a draw. So two solid games. So these guys played actually very high quality chess in these first few games. There weren't a lot of blunders or mistakes or missed chances. So going into game 3, and now MVL repeats the same experiment with white. So Shock Pirate is saying that the problem in this rapid is that both Ding and MVL were too solid. They were very solid, and they're both very good rapid players. Ding Liren is, people don't give him as much credit as he deserves, probably because he is very high rated both in slower games and in rapid. I think he doesn't have as much experience playing online, so if he's playing a 1 minute game, of course, bullet or something like that, he's probably nowhere near as good as those guys like MVL and Hikaru or Magnus Ali Reza. But in this time control, he seems to be holding his own pretty well so far. So they repeat this again, they get a slightly different position. So if you played, bishop c5, knight f3, castles, they could get the same exact position. Instead, here Ding Liren varies with queen a5. But for some reason, I don't know if it's I didn't have time to check like the depth of the theory here, but it seems like in all these positions, black manages to equalize. And so I don't know if there's if this line, you need to go back to the drawing board a little bit with this bishop f4. I'm not totally sure, but I wasn't convinced by the white play the opening white play in these few games. So here, this is sort of a typical structure that you get in the Ragozin, and of course the Nimzo and Ragozin are sort of sister openings, and I don't think white has very much here. Their only chance is to play c4 and have a little majority, but I think Ding Liren holds these positions comfortably. He does manage to get c4, and this was a nice little kind of tactic to get the pawn back. I still think white is a little bit better here, and he got a better position out of the second game than in the first game. So I don't know why Ding Liren deviated. Although this still seems like a position that a player of Ding Liren's caliber is going to hold pretty much every time. The queenside majority is not that incredibly strong, but it's very difficult for white to create a good pass pawn on the king side. So objectively, this should probably be a draw. The black knights are pretty well placed, and once he plays e4, then he can't avoid the trade of a bunch of pawns. So Bogdan is saying, it seems weird to me to play like this with white. Yeah, I mean, it does seem a little bit strange to me that MVL is avoiding his more normal repertoire. But there are a lot of players. Magnus himself will play a bunch of different openings, like he played the Alekhine yesterday in the first game, which is a game that you don't necessarily want to take too many chances. So some players like to vary from the regular repertoire to be sort of surprising their opponents. But so far for MVL in this particular event, it hasn't worked too well. Although generally speaking, of course, he's done extremely well in rapid events, and I am a big fan of his play in general. So this position, it gets kind of close to looking like white has something, but the problem is he just can't avoid so many pawns being traded. And here there's a lot of different possible simplifications that are just equal. So you can't even keep one minor piece. And so, of course, optically white looks better, but it's just this is just a drawn endgame. The pawn endgame is no chance. In theory, if you have a protected pass pawn, then of course you're winning. But this is not going to be a real protected pass pawn, because as soon as we force the pawn to f6, so if the pawn comes to f6, then we have h6 and taking the pawn on f6 and h6. So which is, they show us why. So king d6. The idea is to come to e5, and then next move he plays h6, forces a pawn trade, and then it's a draw. So they did play it till the very end, so we get two bare kings. I don't think that was a fantasy question. It would have been a good one if any of the games would finish with bare kings. So that leaves us with the fourth game. And the fourth game was Ding Liren with white. And again, it seems like MVL Slav was a little bit shaky. So this exchange variation has more poison than it looks. And it's interesting because sometimes at club level it can be used as you're playing a higher rated opponent, you play the exchange Slav, and then basically you try to trade all the pieces. So the line that if you want to make a draw with white, then you play bishop d3. Black can't really you can try to keep the bishop, but the best move is to, let's say, take, then you play bishop d6, which is again the best move. You could play bishop e7, but it's not as good. And then all the pieces get traded and players make a draw, right? So this is but the exchange Slav actually has a lot of venom, and if you don't know really well how to play it with black, you tend to just get into a worse position. So, but here Ding Liren plays bishop e2, which is, he probably did this on purpose, playing something that's not as well known to try to throw MVL off, who doesn't normally play the Slav. The main moves are either bishop b5 or rook c1, queen b3 also. So there's a lot of moves that have been played many times. Bishop e2 is sort of a little bit more obscure. So bishop d6, knight e5, castles, knight c6. So I think here this is probably still okay. I don't know, actually. This is already sort of a risky decision by MVL. I wonder if instead of castling, so because these positions with the compromised pawn structure become very, very dangerous, and he just got a bad position with black in this game. I don't know if there's trying to see what the right move here would be, because I know bishop e2. So bishop e2 is not considered to be the most threatening move. It's possible that safer is just to play bishop e7, keep the symmetry, and then just castle and see what white is going to do, because this bishop d6, knight e5. If you take with the bishop on e5, pawn takes e5, knight d7, maybe that's possible actually. He would probably take with the bishop on e5. Then because otherwise it's hard to defend this pawn. Knight takes, pawn takes, knight d7, f4 now, or queen d4. Maybe queen d4. This might be okay for black actually. I think this is a fairly typical position and maybe is not so bad. So maybe that's one thing that he could have done. Because I don't like the position that he gets here after knight takes e6, bishop d6, castles. c5 is very natural. I mean, you could try to make a rook move first, but c5 is very natural. Knight b5, pawn takes. And I think here black is just worse. And I think that was also the opinion of, the whole crew of Peter Svidler, Jan Gustafsson, Fabiano Caruana. So yeah, I mean, I think this is a pretty difficult endgame to play. It's very unpleasant, and so but he doesn't really have a choice. So he takes on d4, knight d4, rook b8, b3, bishop g6. At some point, white might want to take on f5, of course. And here, I think Ding Liren had to be extremely happy with the position that he got. He's got a couple of fairly easy plans, like of doubling on the c file and then starting to push the pawns, and that a pawn is always going to be a target. This looked like it could be, a game that Ding Liren would win, but somehow he didn't. So yeah, I mean, not that it's easy. It's not like a winning position, but it looks tough. So one idea was to play knight c6. This was mentioned in our broadcast, and then start pushing the pawns like b4. And then potentially just play a4, b5, and try to make progress that way. And that seemed very logical. The move that he makes is also logical. He plays rook c7, knight e8, rook c5. So he gets his rook to a good square. He preferred, I guess, to bring the knight to e8, because if he played rook c5 right away, maybe he didn't like knight d7. King f8, rook c1. So all of this seemed quite natural. He plays f3 to give his king some room and also stop knight e4 in some cases. So they trade off a pair of rooks, but that doesn't really solve black's issues. Now here, I think he may have played a little bit. He may have just, this plan of playing, he plays the next few moves, king f2, king e1, king d2. Maybe that was just a little bit slow, and maybe it was time to play either b4 or a4. And I think that's what, not Hikaru, but Fabiano was mentioning during the stream. B4, I think, was his favorite. And then, again, try to play a4, b5 first. And it seems like black is really, really tied up here. When he plays king f2, the problem is that eventually black will probably prepare to play e5. And so here already he's close, right? Like e5 doesn't always work because you'll have knight b5. So if you play e5 too early, like let's say here, knight b5, the d5 pawn, let me remove these squares. The d5 pawn is a bit of a problem. So knight b5, bishop b5, king d6, rook c6, king e7. This is tough, right? Like, so you have to be prepared when you play e5. But this king maneuver from king g1 to f2 to e1 to d2 is a little bit slow, and so finally he manages to get e5 in, and it still looks like it's worse for black, but it's closer to equality, because now after knight b5 he can simply take and play king d6. So and this end game looks like black is probably okay, because even if white can get his pawns to b4, a4, b5, a5, black will have king c5, and it's probably going to be some kind of fortress. Yes, Shock Pirate has mentioned they were also Grishuk Nepo. We had a lot of people in our commentary today, a very high average rating. So always great to listen to if you have the time. And then you can catch the after show afterwards to hear some more, or if you don't have the time to see all the games, then you get to see them in this medium with some commentary. All right. So now, basically, what happened is what I was talking about, that white gets their pawns to nice squares, but you cannot easily play b5 without allowing king c5. And so this position is just equal. So sort of a bummer for Ding Liren to not have won this game from a very, very nice position. But then MVL picks to play black. So apparently he won the coin toss to decide the color, picks the black pieces. And so this means he's got 4 minutes against Ding Liren's 5 minutes. But he's got draw odds as black. So he only needs to draw. Now, this opening is very, very strange. So it's hard. I would love to speak to MVL, and I'm sure we will speak to him in the next few days on our stream, and we'll find out what happens. So this move, bishop f5, is sort of an old line considered dubious, because white can simply play cd, queen b3, and there's a problem defending both b7 and d5. And this, has happened in countless sort of beginner games where you can win a pawn like this and there's not much compensation. So, of course, this is well known by everyone, and so including MVL. So I wonder if he just played too fast and assumed like almost like a mouse slip where you pre-move and think that he's going to play e3. But that doesn't really make sense, because you really wouldn't ever assume that white is not going to take on d5, for example. It's just too dangerous, right? So I don't think it's a pre-move. But why would he go for this? The only other thing is that this line with knight takes d5, which he plays, is actually quite tricky. So maybe he just decided to go for a line that he knows is not great, but is very tricky. So the rest goes according to sort of the known theory, which is considered bad for black. Knight takes d5. Now, queen takes b3 is possible, and I think we give a check. King d7, pawn takes b3 here, and this is just not really a very fun endgame for black, because their king will never, of course, be able to castle, and yeah, I mean, it's just not a great position, but it is it's not lost, of course. In the game, he plays c takes d5, and this is actually a really tricky variation. But yeah, a few people in the chat are saying it was hard to understand what happened here. It is really hard to understand. Now, this line, I did get some inside information about this line from Alex Estane Lopez, who will probably be on the after show with me in a couple of days. We haven't exactly fixed the date. Maybe with Fiona, as David Howell was talking about earlier. But in this position, it's a tricky one, because even though white is up a pawn, it can get very complicated, and there is a little bit of theory here. So knight c6, e3, bishop b4 check. I'm sorry, not bishop b4, knight b4, queen a4 check, and this has all been played before. And now here, Alex was telling me that the most testing move is king e7, and so this all looks really bizarre. And so it's hard to play without actually knowing anything. And this is still a bad variation for black, but it's actually really tricky. In the game, MVL played king d8, and I'll show you the game first, and then we'll go back to king e7, because it's a pretty amazing variation. But after king e7, bishop d2, very strong move. The point of this move is that you're letting black come into c2, because you have bishop a5 if they take the rook. And now after knight c2, king e2. You can't play king d1, by the way, so there are a bunch of tricks, right? Because bishop a5 is met by bishop c2, and this is now good for black. So you got to play king to e2, but after king e2, the position is just a disaster. Like there's not really any move. The best that black can do, I guess, is some kind of queen trade, but of course, with their knight on c2, this is completely lost. Knight e5 next. Yeah, this is, of course, a disaster. So after king e2, he plays queen takes b2, which is sort of a desperate attempt. But now knight e5 is extremely strong, threatening queen d7, and there's really no move. So it's kind of amazing. I think MVL has had 2 Armageddon games that he's lost in like 15 moves or so. Here he played b5, queen a5, king e8, queen c7, and he just resigned. So really fast, and king c8 doesn't help either. I think we just do queen a6. and it's completely over. So with queen b7 or queen c6. So let's go back though to the position, because this is quite interesting. After queen a4 check, king e7. This one is kind of a fascinating position. So black wants to give a check on c2. Of course, they're down a pawn and their king is on e7. So if white could play bishop e2 and castle, it would be already over. But it's not so simple. So how do you stop this? And so the best move, and I don't know, if Ding Liren knew the theory, then maybe he finds this. But it's actually much easier for black to play than for white here. So the really, I think the only way to an advantage is to play knight e5. You're threatening queen to d7. So now you give a check. King d1, more or less forced. Rook d8. And so king e2 is not as good, I guess, mostly because now the king is blocking the bishop. And so again, this is not a trivial position. This is actually hard for white to find a good move here. So okay, so king d1, rook to d8. So now the idea is that you're stopping queen d7 with a rook on d8, and you're threatening knight takes d4. And so, of course, a move like rook b1 is just losing, right? Like knight takes d4, and this is a disaster for white. So white has to play an enterprising move here, but they do have one, so they can play g4, attacking the bishop. Now black tries bishop e4. So if you play knight d4 here, so g takes f5. Again, this is, to play this in Armageddon, if you've never seen it, is very tricky. Like, you have to be able to see that on g4, you can let a discovered check happen, and somehow it's winning. And so even though, of course, black can say take a rook here. So this is sort of the point, actually. You can just run with the king and go to b1. This happens in the other line that I'll show you, and you take the knight on a1. I had no idea about this variation, by the way, so I was sort of amazed just looking at it. So thanks to Alex Astana for setting this to me after the game. So after bishop e4, the right move for white is f3. Again, really the only move. That one is, I guess, easy enough to find. Knight takes d4, really the only chance now. And now just pawn takes e4. So you have to be very brave, let the discovered check happen. And now somehow there's not really a good way for black. If you go knight c6, then the knight just comes back to d3. This is fine. And so knight b3 is sort of best. King c2, knight a1, king b1. Eventually that knight is going to drop. And I guess white is close to winning. The king is not safe, so it's probably, maybe it is just winning for white. So this is a bad variation for black, but if he had played king to d8, if he had played king to e7 instead of king to d8, well, this might have been still kind of interesting. So this is surprising, because for a variation that I thought, I sort of knew that this bishop f5 was bad, but I never played this for black, and this sort of Slav with knight c3, knight f3 has never been in my white repertoire. So I had no idea, and this is kind of a fascinating line and shows that there's some interesting stuff in chess if you look underneath the surface, right? Like in my mind, it's just like bishop f5 is a bad move. You play cd, queen b3, and that's it, right? That's all that I knew as a reasonably okay player. So, but try to learn something every single day. So now let's go to the Anish Giri match against Jan Nepomniachtchi. And I think Anish Giri, people are saying he's having a bad tournament. He is having a bad tournament, but he's had plenty of good positions. And today he had two really good positions with white. He just wasn't able to convert. And the game with black that he did lose, he had, a perfectly fine position. So he's just not been able to convert. So Jan goes for the Grunfeld. Unlike MVL, he decided to stick with it. Now these lines are interesting. I think if you were listening to David Howell, the banter blitz that he just was doing on Chess 24 a few minutes ago, he talked a lot about how Leela, well, not a lot, but he talked about how Leela likes to, push the H-pawn forward. This is certainly true in the Grunfeld. And so in both of these games, Anish eventually pushes his H-pawn forward. And I'm not too familiar with, I know this line with bishop b7 is an interesting one. These pawn sacrifices, black tends to get good counterplay in these positions. Playing with one pawn on the b file versus these two that are both targets. but I don't know like the ins and out, because the theory in the Grunfeld goes really, really deep. So bishop b5, a little bit of a mysterious move, but I think in some cases he's preparing to play d4, d5. Um, and in some cases he might be improving the position if he takes on c5. So it's sort of an odd move. You're not really worried about a6, because now I think that this pawn structure would be good for white. You could do this, or you could play takes maybe. I don't know, but or maybe you just no. It's got to be d5, bishop b7, and then probably just c4. Probably c4. Yeah, I think this is a very pleasant position. You'd love to play queen d2, bishop h6, trade that bishop. Yeah, so I think a6 just creates weaknesses. So, but bishop b5 is not a move that I had seen before. So he plays rook c8, queen d2. Queen d2 with bishop h6 is very normal. e6, rook d1, cd, cd, queen d6. So black wants to play rook fd8, and now h4. And so this is the kind of plan that used to be kind of frowned upon, and now with Lila AlphaZero, they love to push that pawn to h6 and kind of create long-term attacking chances, or just unpleasantness, with the back rank. Queen b4. So here, I actually thought this was a really well played game by Anish, and I think here after queen e3, h6, I think this might have been a critical moment, and this is a tough sequence, but he had an interesting way to play it here. And so let's first look at what he did to kind of see how things get simplified, and then what we can do about it. So Anish played bishop takes h6, and now rather than taking the pawn on h4, which would be just bad, I think, because of e5 followed by, say, g3. So this is a really bad position, actually. He plays knight takes d4. And now basically a ton of pieces get traded. Rook takes c8. So you can take on d4 first, but it doesn't really change anything. Rook takes c1 happens, followed by taking on d4. And this pawn structure is just going to be okay for black. And so Anish tried to play a few moves, but really there's too much stuff getting traded here. So they just agreed to a draw. But the position after h6 is really interesting. And so I spent a little bit of time on this one. Obviously, there's 8 games, so I don't have time to spend an hour on each of them. But I did think this was one of the more interesting positions. And so I looked at bishop takes c6 here. And the position is still really interesting. Black has to take back on c6. I mostly looked at rook takes because I think black wants to trade pieces. So rook takes. Now you play rook takes, bishop h6. So in this case, you're forced to play bishop h4. And now we get our position with e5. And this one I thought was really interesting. You're threatening to play g3. And so it's not exactly easy to get out of this. So you could play something like, a natural move might be to move the queen. So let's say queen b7. But now you have bishop g5. And I think this type of position is going to be really dangerous for black, right? So the knight is going to jump onto f4. We have the possibility maybe to do a little rook to d3 to h3. This looks like a dangerous position. There is probably something better. So after e5, he's threatening g3. So the computer actually finds some sort of amazing resources that I think nobody would look at. So bishop a8 is one of them. The idea is that bishop a8 someone might look at. The idea is that on g3 you have queen b7. So you're threatening mate. And then on f3, queen takes f3, and the queen takes, bishop takes, the knight on e2 is hanging. So this one is kind of deep, but we don't have to play g3. So we can play, for example, f3 first, which is actually a very human move. Don't need a computer to find that one. And now the threat is to play g3. And now queen b7 doesn't have the same impact with of course, the attempt at transposing. But now you can just play, I guess, bishop g5, and we get the same kind of position that we had before, where I think white is much better. And so I thought this, would be pretty difficult to play. So after going back to e5, how else do we stop g3? Or without allowing this bishop g5? Well, the computer finds one more thing to bug me with, king h7. Now that one, there's definitely no way that a human would play this. The idea is that on g3, you play rook to h8. Now, if somebody finds this in a game as a defense, I'll be very suspicious. And the idea is that on pawn takes, you just play queen h4, and you have this queen g4, queen h1. There's a bunch of threats here, as well as the bishop. Now, that being said, king h7 doesn't force g3. I mean, g3 is probably okay, but on rook h8, you can play f3, for example, to stop the nonsense on h1. And we just get a mess of a position. But really, the only move to hold for black here is g5 to threaten that bishop on h6. But this is still a pleasant position, gh, king h6. And I think just king f2, normal, natural human move to play rook e1, rook g1 or rook h1, something like that. And I think black's king is gonna suffer here. So I thought this was actually a pretty interesting and pretty instructive Grunfeld position, and I thought it was worth showing. So now I'm going to go through the other games a little bit quicker, because the after show is supposed to be quicker than the entire broadcast. This is the game that Jan won, and so it was really the critical game. They played this line bishop c5. This has been really popular for a couple of years. You know, it used to be everybody would play the positions with knight b6, and these have been very heavily analyzed. Bishop c5, I think Fabiano, a lot of players have played this. And so it's becoming sort of a main theoretical debate. And it's essentially like playing a Sicilian with reverse colors. And but because white is up a tempo, they're typically doing a little bit better than in the regular Sicilian. I don't know that I love this queen c2 to a4 to d1. I've never seen this plan. Normally I've seen games with knight d5 or castles first. So I'm not sure that this was an incredibly successful experiment. But Jan is always well prepared and plays extremely fast, so he puts pressure on his opponent. Knight d4 looks like a good response. And this seems like the sort of position that they get in this line where it looks like it should be about equal, but it's sort of a fresh position, playable for both sides. And now you may wonder why bishop takes e3 is not played. Like, what is with this structure? Is it really that good for white? And it's hard to it's certainly not bad for black to play this type of position, but it's not easy to come up with a plan. While it is kind of easy for white to play, they have easy moves: queen d2, rook c1, trying to bring the knight to c5. And even though these pawns are doubled, they really kind of prevent any sort of kingside attack from black. So, but this is certainly a playable position for black as well. So he played knight d4, which kind of leads to a little bit of simplification here. And Jan is someone who he seems to play very concrete tactical positions well. So he goes for a plan that, again, is very, very concrete. Things get simplified. It looks like it could get drawish kind of quickly. So this position occurs, and this is sort of instructive. I mean, he played, Anish here played bishop h3, and you wonder, like, can this endgame really be unpleasant for black? And I think the answer is that a little bit, but it should be. I mean, I still have trouble believing that this wouldn't somehow be a draw. But the problem is that it's hard to, even though it looks like white has a useless majority of pawns here of 4 against 3, while he's got 3 against 2 on this side. It looks like it's a little bit easier for white to create threats against these pawns, and that the king is a little bit less safe on h8 than the king on g1 is. So it may be that this is a little bit easier for white to play. It still seems hard to believe that an endgame like this is really going to be that much worse for black. But it's maybe one day we'll find out. So bishop h3, rook takes b2, queen b2, and now Jan does play a very interesting idea, which is worth noting. So he plays queen c1, rook b8. Queen a2 was a possibility here, and I wonder if his idea was to play just queen a1, hoping to play this endgame. But it's certainly not clear that white is going to be much better here. So I do wonder what he intended after queen e2. He might have intended queen c5. That's another possibility I looked at. The rook move somewhere, or king g8. Let's say king g8. and then you can play a rook move like rook to e1 or rook c1, and then you're going to pick up one of the pawns. But again, it's hard to believe that black is going to lose this position. So maybe queen takes a2. Queen takes a2 would have been an interesting way to play. So instead he plays sorry, what is it? He plays rook b8. Sorry, rook b8 instead of queen takes a2. And now I think this was actually a mistake because it lets Jan go for this really interesting long-term exchange sacrifice, which I think is just more pleasant for white to play. It's probably not worse for black, but it's definitely hard to play, especially in this time control, because the king, he's forced to do something here, right? Like a7 and f7 are hanging. He can't play, of course, queen a2 because the rook hangs. So this is a little bit of it's just a unpleasant position to play. So I think he might have wanted to avoid that. So let's fast forward a little bit here. F5 is not a move that you really want to play if you don't have to, and I wonder if he regretted it afterward. Maybe he could have just played queen a5 or queen c5 and just wait. F5 seems to create a weakness. We'll see later that turns out to be relevant. But it's a hard position to play because if you feel like if you move the queen, eventually the pawn will just start jumping, and white will play h4, h5. Once they get their pawn to h5, are you going to play h6 and create these light square weaknesses? Objectively, I think if you're playing a computer probably manages to find tricky ways to stop all the threats and make a draw in this kind of position. But as a human, I know I would find it very unpleasant to defend. So I'm fast forwarding again. Jan, by the way, plays so fast. I think he still had like 12 minutes here. He's just, he's incredibly fast. He's always played fast. In slow games, he plays fast. And in this time control, in the very last game, I think he still had 19 minutes. So he gained almost 5 minutes, on the clock while playing. So here the position has got to be a little bit difficult for black. So rook d6 was a mistake. But now Jan played too fast. He missed his one chance to really increase his advantage. He had to move g4. And this was pointed out by, our commentators. We're not using an engine. I know sometimes, of course, it's easy as the armchair quarterback here. But g4 was a move that certainly, if he spent, 30 seconds, he would spot it. And now it's not like it wins instantly, but what it does is that it basically forces the win of the f pawn. And that's a big difference. And so black has to play rook f6 because you don't want to lose it, you don't want to lose it with a queen check. Then you can play queen e8, let's say. Queen e8 or queen d7 are probably both quite similar. And now you can never take on g4 because of bishop e4 check, which just wins the house. Oh, my daughter just came in. I thought that I had locked the office door. She is 1 year old and loves to barge in mostly when I'm streaming. I don't think she made it into the camera shot though. All right, so after rook f6, queen e8, yeah, so this position would just be really tough. I mean, I don't think black would hold for more than a few moves because next what's going to happen is just g takes f5, bishop e4, and then black is going to run out of useful waiting moves, and the pawns will you might even lose the d pawn. It's just becoming untenable. So instead he plays queen e7, rook d8. He plays queen e6. Queen e6 was just a blunder. I think he missed queen a6, and now he's forced to trade queens. Certainly not what he wanted. And he still has sort of practical chances to win this endgame, but that one should have been a draw. Well, should have been a draw, or could have been a draw, I should say. Of course, it's easier without the pressure of actually playing the position. But here, it was actually kind of amazing because to me, optically, it looked like this should be a winning endgame for white. You win basically the d4 pawn by force. But it turns out that if black plays the right sort of waiting moves, they're actually able to hold. So rook g1, I'll show you when it actually becomes losing. King f6 was still fine. Rook g1. So rook g1 apparently was the mistake here, I think. So apparently he could just have been sitting, and so playing like king d6, king d6, bishop b5, king e6, let's say. king d4, king d6, and apparently you can play this way and somehow hold. These pawns are not going to queen by themselves, which surprises me. And I feel like I still need to analyze this, but I know the computer gives equality, and generally, of course, the computer is right and not me. But to me, it seemed like this would be likely. Well, actually, he always has to keep the king on d6. This I finally actually understood, to prevent the white king from coming through. And it seems like there's not really a good way to make progress here. So now we start giving checks, go back, I guess. And apparently even this, so I looked at this for a while. Apparently this is still a draw. So sort of instructive, because I would have assumed that this would just be losing. And apparently it's not. So, but I feel like it's hard to fault black for losing this position. So he goes rook g1, very natural. He's trying to reduce the pawns. But now, unfortunately, after a5, rook g4, a6, this bishop gets to b7. This is an old scheme, right? Like when you so now what happens if he goes rook g1? Well, then the king goes this way, and it's just too fast, right? We're getting the king to b7, and then we play a7, a8. So it's too fast. So he goes here, but now the bishop gets to b7, and this is like I said, an old scheme that we've seen a million times. The rook is trapped, and so now it's just a question of a race between the h pawn and the king getting to b6, but it's not really that close of a race. White queens in time to have a two pawn up endgame, and the one pawn queen endgames are always interesting and sometimes drawn, sometimes winning, sometimes drawn. Two pawns are almost always a trivial win, mostly because there's never a pawn endgame that's a draw. Every single pawn endgame is a win. And so generally, like when you look at endgames, if simplifications help one side win, it's typically very hard to hold, because you can't forever avoid trades. So in this case, eventually he gets into a queen trade. There was no way to avoid a queen trade here. Just showing you a few sample variations. You can't avoid a queen trade, so it's just lost. So tough loss for Anish Giri, who then has to try to win with white. And in this game, he again, it is a crazy hold. Fish45 here in the chat saying that this endgame holding, it's actually hard to believe. I stared at the computer for a long time, and I can't even say that I fully understand. And I think if someone tells you they understand that why this is a hold, instantly, I don't care if it's a 2800 player. I think it's wrong. It's not obvious to the human eye at all that endgame is a draw. But I don't doubt that it is, because computers are absolutely amazing these days. All right, so they get sort of the same. This is the same type of position. He played rook d1. I believe in the other game he had played. Actually, no, he did play rook d1. It's after queen d6. There's an h4 that happens sort of at a different moment in this game. It's very similar type of position. But I think black here was happier than in the other one. So they get this position, and here I think Jan again, just playing so fast. It's possible that he could have taken the pawn on e4. He was afraid, I'm sure, of h6, king g8, or let's say maybe king f8 here. Yeah, I looked at some lines here where maybe this was actually playable for black. Of course, it looks very dangerous. So I can see why he wouldn't go for this, but the speed at which he plays is unbelievable, and it got him in trouble in this game. So now queen e3. I think white now is just much better. And Anish again plays well up to this point. He's actually played really well, I think, in this game. Now any queen trade is not possible because of rook b7. So he plays e5, which is actually probably just a mistake. I guess he had moved maybe like bishop d5, which loses a pawn. So e5 is a bit of a desperado move. Pawn takes, rook, queen takes e4, bishop e4, knight h3. Now he's threatening knight g5, and this looks like it's already just completely winning for white. But Anish was getting a little bit short on time and messed this one up. So knight h7. Yeah, even a GM finds these lines challenging. Yeah, for sure. And Dale Hassel, who is a Canadian, so from my home country, a FIDE master, is saying we need to ask Magnus if he thought that that endgame was a dead draw. Yeah, I mean, I would ask him. My feeling is he would say no, but it's a, Magnus is incredible at some of these endgames, and so I would be very curious to see if he saw. And now he's probably seen it, so it's a little unfair because he's already gotten um, a chance to form an opinion, most likely. But I would be curious to see what he would say, because he may have looked at it and said, oh yeah, this is a draw, or oh no, I would have thought that white is winning here, because white can have three pawns, right? It looks three pawns and they're all passed, and it's definitely interesting. Um, so yeah, so this position that Anish didn't win this one is really kind of too bad, as someone who likes to root for Anish also. Um, so Nepomniachtchi always tricky. Plays Rook G4, G3. G3 is a good move. Rook C4. Now, of course, you got to watch for Rook C1 and Rook H1 mate. And this is where he starts to mess up. I feel like if he had more time, he would play F3. Not even a lot of time, but just a little bit more time. He would play F3. And that move seems to just win. So if bishop F3, you'd play knight G5. Of course, the main goal is to queen this pawn. Bishop D5. And now you can either play H7, forces Rook C8. What did I look at here? I think I looked at either Rook takes G6, which looks pretty good, or just Rook takes A6. And in this one, I mean, I don't think you can mess this one up really with white anymore. You'll just start pushing the A pawn. The E pawn is not very dangerous. You can play King F2, King E3, and that pawn on H7 is just a monster. So I don't think he would. I don't think he would mess this one up. Um, there's ideas also like Rook A5 coming. So with like Rook takes D5 and Knight F7. So this one looks like it's just completely winning. Um, but he played Rook B1. I think he just, didn't want to give his F pawn without being sure, and probably thought he was just going to win anyway. But now after Rook C8, it's actually hard to keep the pawns, and I think he may have just underestimated this, with little time on the clock. So now the threat is Rook H8. It gets tricky. So if he plays the most obvious Knight G5, I think you start with Rook H8, H7, King F6. And now the thing is, after F4, which seems like, okay, now everything's protected. Well, it's actually not so simple. Here after King F5, there's a bit of a problem, right? So Rook F1, Bishop A2, and suddenly there's not a lot of material left, and you don't really have a way to make progress. Whenever the Rook wins, yeah, I mean, it's this looks really bad. Someone is saying that instead of I guess this is instead of, yeah, King F1 instead of F3. Sure. So in this position, yeah, King F1 was also good. I agree with Bishop F3. I guess you can play either Rook E1 or Rook, either King E1 or Rook B1 probably are both going to be winning, because now Knight G5 will win a tempo on the bishop. So that's a big difference too. Um, so yeah, I mean, I agree with that one. So yeah, this really is too bad for Anish. So he played Rook E1, Rook H8, Rook E5, King D6, and now suddenly it's not actually winning anymore. He plays Rook G5 because, so if you move, well, you can't really. He doesn't really have a choice anymore. Rook G5, Rook H7, Rook G6. He takes all of the pawns, but the king is just not in a good position here to get out. King H2, King F5. Yeah, this was really a shame for Anish, who had done sort of everything right in this game. So ends in a draw here. Of course, not nothing to play for then. So in the last game, he was black, and Jan just blitzed out everything. It's not a great game, so I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. Um, Jan played this line, Bishop D7, which I think is a very reasonable line for white. It's also one of the if you're going to play against Bishop B5 check and you have to win as black, that's a line that makes sense to play, because it's harder to get sort of a really stable position as white. In the if you play the main lines of with Bishop D7 instead, those lines, White has a pretty stable position with the Maroxy bind right away. So it's it's knight d7 we played when you have to try to win. So you do get a Maroxy bind here too, but it's a little bit of a more fluid one because you have the bishop pair for black. But Jan doesn't play this in the most impressive way here. I mean, this was okay, but it's clear that he just was blitzing to try to get Anish to run out of time and just keep a solid position. And he did fine, I guess. It's not like Black had too many chances, although it got to be a little bit dicey for him. This position that he gets. So Anish here is effectively up a pawn. However, it's not enough to be winning, and because the best that White ends up getting that Black ends up getting is an endgame where they have 3 against 2 here on the king side, and these pawns all go away, and that's going to be a theoretical draw. Whether there's 2 rooks on a board, 4 rooks on a board, is still going to be a theoretical draw. But of course, you can try. And so Anish does try to get it in a good way. And in fact, Black is almost happier playing with all the pawns on the board because they have more chances. Than they'd rather be equal pawns with these doubled c-pawns and all the rooks than to be forced into a rook ending that they know is a theoretical draw. And so they play a lot of moves here. In this position, it was actually probably simpler for Nepomniachtchi to go here. Because here you can't take on c4, so maybe he could have done that as a way to force this endgame. Would have been possible, but instead he goes rook a8. I mean, ultimately they get the same sort of position here, and this, even though of course Black is up a pawn, eventually you're forced to trade more pawns in order to make progress. And so g5 eventually will have to be played, and then once g5 is played, well, there's not really any chance to win. Once you're, of course, these 2 against 1 is almost never winning unless your king is like able to get to f3 or h3, which doesn't happen unless it starts there basically. So they just play a lot more moves, of course, because Anish had to try. It makes sense to try. But in this case, it doesn't succeed, of course. So tough match for Anish, who really was close to drawing the one game that he lost, and was close to winning, if not outright winning, in the games with White. I thought that the first Grunfeld was a really interesting game in position. So I it's hard not to feel bad for him. Let me go back to my other scene here and show you the standings. So these are the standings. Magnus on top with 8 points. The way the scoring works is that you get 3 points for a match win, for a clean match win, I should say. And then if you win in Armageddon, you get 2 points, and that's why you have a slightly wider distribution of points than you get in more classical type scoring. And so Hikaru in second place, Ding Li Ren in third. 2 players with 5 points, MVL and Jan Nepomniachtchi. 3 players and Fabiano. And then at the very bottom, Anish and Alireza, who have yet to get on the scoreboard, by tying or winning a match. Surprising, because everybody here is a very, very strong player. And Anish, I think, has had a little bit of bad luck. Alireza has definitely had a little bit of bad luck also. And so I suspect they'll get out of that spot, but it's I think in rapid chess, momentum plays a bit of a role, more so than in slower games. It's harder to recover, and so. But I do hope that both of these guys start to get some points on the board and fight for at least a place in the top 5, let's say. It can change pretty quickly. So yeah, an interesting day of chess. I mean, it was great that we got another Armageddon game, I thought, but the Armageddon game itself was a little bit disappointing. Although it gave us a chance to look at a crazy theoretical, sort of old theory, I guess I should say, variation. Where was it? I was just gonna yeah, so in the Slav. Yeah, let's see how Magnus does tomorrow. If you haven't filled out your fantasy chess bracket, I highly recommend that you fill it out. Um, I have done a lot of work on it, and we have some really cool prizes this time, thanks to our sponsor, Unibet. And so, yeah, go ahead and fill that out before the beginning. Of course, it's before the beginning of the games, because once you have information, it would be unfair. Um, you might have noticed that in the overall fantasy contest, John Ludwig Hammer, who streams on Chess24 a lot, was tied for first place, which is surprising. Usually, the top players don't seem to be doing that well in the fantasy chess contest, but he's doing really well. We also had Agad Matar, who is has a very popular, of course, YouTube channel. He was doing really well too. I am not doing that amazingly. And yeah, so thanks everybody for tuning into the after show. I will be back tomorrow. We have a couple of fun things coming up, by the way. We're gonna have an after show with probably Fiona Steele Anthony, and that you may have seen her vlogs, and Alex Estane Lopez, who is an Irish professional player and coach and really great guy. He sent me some analysis today on this Slav variation that I've very much appreciated. So they'll be on. Then we'll also have Anna Rudolph, who is coming out with a course on Chessable. So we're going to have a few fun events with her. I think I'm going to play. You guys might have seen a little match that we played against the Spanish commentary team, English against Spanish. We'll have the same thing with Anna as my partner, which should be a lot of fun. And yeah, so again, thanks for tuning in. A lot of fun stuff coming up. Also, of course, make sure to tune in to our regular broadcast with Jan and his crew of degenerates. I'll call it that way today. Lawrence Trent, Alex Grischuk, of course, Peter Zvidler, who is a great person in explaining. I get a lot of my tips from Peter when I listen to him, and then some banter blitz with cool people. David Howell, he told me he's listening to my show. I'm not sure if that's true, but if it is, I certainly appreciate that, and then I hope we get him back for Banter Blitz, because he's a good he's also great at explaining this stuff. So all right, I'm done talking for today. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and I'll see you all tomorrow.
Three.